Something happened that perfectly captures how American foreign policy has drifted into self-sabotage. Donald Trump announced a large-scale U.S. strike on Venezuela, claiming the operation captured Nicolas Maduro and flew him out of the country. The headlines exploded. The footage rolled. The language was triumphal. But the first real question wasn't about legality or escalation or even war. It was simpler and far more disturbing. Why would the United States attack the country with the largest proven oil reserves on earth? Venezuela holds more oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than anyone. At a moment when Americans complain daily about gas prices, energy security, and inflation, Washington chose to destabilize a country that could directly ease those pressures. That's not strategy. That's like torching your own supply line and calling it strength. This wasn't framed as an energy decision. It was framed as toughness, as action, as proof of resolve. But foreign policy isn't theater, even when it's sold like one. Real strategy asks a brutal question. First, does this make the country stronger? And if you pause for even a moment, the answer here becomes deeply uncomfortable. We didn't strike an enemy that threatens our survival. We struck a potential partner whose resources we desperately need, while our biggest global competitor quietly benefits. This is where the story really begins. Because once you strip away the patriotic language and cable news adrenaline, what's left is a decision that seems to run directly against American interests. And when that happens, you have to ask not just what we did, but why we did it and who actually pays the price. Strip away the slogans and the flags, and what you're left with is math. Brutal, unforgiving math. Venezuela is not just oil rich on paper. It is a country sitting on reserves so vast that under normal circumstances, they should act as a stabilizer in a world constantly flirting with energy shocks. Instead, U.S. actions have repeatedly helped push those barrels further off the market, tightening supply at the exact moment Americans feel it most at the pump. The rival video points out a critical contradiction here, and it's one that deserves to be slowed down. Every time Venezuelan production is disrupted by sanctions, by instability, by outright military action, global supply shrinks. When supply shrinks, prices don't politely stay overseas. They travel. They show up in U.S. gas stations, in trucking costs, in grocery bills. Energy markets don't care about rhetoric. They care about barrels. Supporters of the strike argue this was about removing a hostile regime, not managing oil flows. But that argument ignores how energy power actually works. You don't need to love a government to trade with it. The United States has spent decades buying oil from countries whose values sharply diverge from its own. Because energy security is not a moral exercise, it's a survival one. Cutting yourself off from supply doesn't weaken your rivals, it hands them leverage. And here's the quiet detail most viewers miss. While Venezuelan output stays constrained, other producers fill the gap. Not American drillers fast enough to offset it, but foreign suppliers who gain market share without firing a shot. Every barrel Venezuela doesn't sell to the U.S. is a barrel someone else sells instead, often at higher prices and with fewer political strings attached. So when this strike is sold as strength, the energy math tells a different story. It looks less like pressure on an adversary and more like a self-inflicted squeeze. And once you see that, the question changes. This stops being about ideology or even Venezuela itself. It becomes about whether U.S. policy is aligning with reality or fighting it. Once Venezuelan oil is pushed further off the market, the vacuum doesn't stay empty. It never does. Energy shortages are invitations, and someone always answers them. While Washington frames the strike as a blow against the dictator, the real beneficiaries are far quieter, far more patient, and far more strategic. China doesn't need to fire a missile to win an energy war. It only needs access. Every disruption in Venezuela tightens Beijing's leverage elsewhere, allowing it to secure long-term supply deals at discounts while competitors scramble. Russia benefits too, not because it loves Caracas, but because constrained supply lifts global prices and expands the value of every barrel it already controls. In energy geopolitics, chaos is currency. U.S. allies feel this immediately. Europe, already stretched by previous shocks, watches another potential source of diversification get destabilized. Developing economies face higher import costs. Meanwhile, American consumers are told to absorb temporary pain in the name of toughness, even as rivals lock in structural advantages that last years, not news cycles. This is the layer the rival content touched on but didn't fully press. When you remove oil from the market, you don't punish a regime in isolation. You rebalance power globally. And unless you replace that supply fast and cheaply, you end up subsidizing competitors who are more than happy to step in. They don't make speeches, they sign contracts. That's why this moment matters beyond Venezuela. It exposes a pattern where U.S. actions create openings that others exploit with discipline and patience. Strength, in this context, isn't about dramatic strikes. It's about controlling outcomes. And here, the outcomes are drifting away from American hands, barrel by barrel, deal by deal. Here's where the trap closes. Once the strike is announced and the headlines harden, Washington loses flexibility. Walking it back looks weak. Escalating raises costs. Doing nothing leaves consequences to compound. That's the paradox of force used without an energy exit plan. It compresses choices until none of them are clean. Inside the system, the conversation shifts from intent to containment. How do you reassure markets without reopening supply? How do you calm allies without conceding leverage? How do you argue strength while prices climb and voters feel it immediately? Each answer collides with the same constraint. Oil doesn't respond to talking points. It responds to barrels, timelines, and certainty. This is the piece most viewers never see. Sanctions, strikes, and statements all land on the same market reality. If Venezuelan production stays offline, prices stay elevated. If prices stay elevated, political pressure rises at home. That pressure forces policy improvisation, and improvisation in energy almost always favors whoever controls spare capacity. The United States does not. Others do. Meanwhile, Caracas becomes less relevant than the signal sent to producers everywhere else. If supply can be removed abruptly for political reasons, risk premiums rise across the board. Producers demand better terms. Long-term contracts tilt away from spot markets. The very system the U.S. relies on for flexibility tightens against it. So the decision doesn't just target a government, it reshapes expectations. And expectations, once reset, are expensive to undo. What began as a show of resolve now boxes Washington into managing fallout rather than shaping outcomes. The question is no longer whether the strike was justified. It's whether the consequences can be contained before they harden into a new normal. The first place Americans feel foreign policy mistakes is not on a map. It's at the pump, at the checkout line, and in monthly bills that suddenly don't add up. As oil supply tightens and uncertainty hardens, prices move faster than explanations ever can. Futures jump. Shipping costs climb. Inflation pressure sneaks back into places policymakers swore were under control. This is where the narrative starts to crack. You can frame a strike as strength for a few days. You can talk about resolve on television, but you cannot explain away a gas price spike to commuters who live paycheck to paycheck. Energy is a multiplier. When it rises, everything else follows: food, transport, manufacturing. The strike doesn't stay over there. It shows up everywhere. Inside Washington, that reality triggers a familiar scramble released from strategic reserves. Reassuring statements to markets. Quiet calls to producers asking for flexibility they no longer have incentive to provide. Each move buys time, not relief. And time is expensive when voters are counting pennies and blaming whoever is in charge. The deeper problem is trust. Consumers have heard this story before. Temporary disruption, short-term pain, long-term benefit. When the promised benefit doesn't arrive, skepticism hardens into anger. And once anger sets in, policy space collapses. Leaders stop planning for optimal outcomes and start planning for survival. This is the moment the rival content hinted at but didn't fully dwell on. Foreign policy that ignores domestic energy math eventually becomes domestic politics. And domestic politics is far less forgiving than geopolitics. Allies might wait. Markets might hedge. Voters do neither. By the time the bill arrives at home, the decision is no longer abstract. It's personal. And that's when the pressure on Washington stops being theoretical and starts dictating what moves are even possible next. As prices climb and volatility hardens, America's allies stop waiting for reassurance and start protecting themselves. Energy ministers hold emergency calls. Refiners rework supply assumptions. Governments quietly ask the same question: how exposed are we if this lasts? The answers are not comforting, and they don't point back to Washington for relief. In Europe, the memory of recent energy shocks is still fresh. Another supply disruption doesn't feel theoretical. It feels familiar. Diversification plans accelerate. Contracts that were once flexible become long-term. Risk premiums get baked in. Each move makes sense on its own, but together they shift leverage away from spot markets and toward producers who can promise stability, even at a cost. In Asia, buyers move faster. They secure barrels early, lock in shipping, and accept narrower margins to avoid uncertainty later. This isn't defiance, it's survival. When supply tightens, waiting is the most expensive option. The result is a quiet reallocation of flows that leaves fewer barrels chasing U.S. demand. When Washington finally asks, this is the consequence Washington rarely anticipates. Allies don't protest loudly when policy raises their costs. They adapt silently, and adaptation hardens over time. Once new routes, contracts, and habits form, they don't unwind just because rhetoric changes. The system learns a new equilibrium. What this does is narrow America's room to maneuver. Every ally that locks in alternative supply reduces the effectiveness of future pressure. Every contract signed elsewhere is leverage surrendered. The strike may have been aimed outward, but the response is inward and cumulative, shrinking options without a single public confrontation. By the time coordination becomes visible, the math has already been done. Allies are no longer waiting to see what Washington will do next. They're acting as if uncertainty is the baseline. And when that assumption spreads, influence fades quietly, not with a bang, but with a drift. At this stage, foreign policy stops living in briefing rooms and starts living in campaign ads. Rising fuel costs turn into attack lines. Lawmakers demand explanations that fit into 30 seconds. Hearings become theater, not because the questions are fake, but because the answers are too complex to land with voters who are already angry. Energy policy, once abstract, becomes personal and immediate. Inside Washington, factions harden. Some argue the strike must be doubled down on to avoid looking weak. Others push for quiet de-escalation to stabilize prices before the next economic report hits. Neither side gets what it wants. Escalation threatens markets. De-escalation threatens credibility. The result is paralysis, dressed up as resolve. Lobbyists feel the shift instantly. Refiners, transport firms, and manufacturers warn that sustained volatility will bleed margins and jobs. Their message isn't ideological, it's arithmetic. Every dollar added to fuel ripples through supply chains. The pressure builds from both directions at once. Voters on one side, balance sheets on the other. This is where the rival content hinted at political fallout. But the mechanism matters. Politics doesn't respond to strategy, it responds to pain. And pain compresses timelines brutally. Decisions that could have waited now have deadlines attached. Messaging gets sharper, blame gets louder. Space for nuanced correction evaporates. Once politics takes the wheel, energy markets react again. Traders price in policy risk. Volatility widens. Hedging costs rise. The feedback loop tightens. Prices drive politics. Politics drive uncertainty. Uncertainty drives prices. Breaking that loop requires supply clarity, not speeches. And clarity is exactly what the strike removed. By the time this collision is fully visible, the original rationale barely matters. The system is now reacting to itself. And when that happens, control slips away from planners and into the hands of momentum. From here, the road forward stops being a single road. It begins to pull apart under pressure, quietly and unevenly, as different actors commit to different assumptions about what comes next. None of these paths are announced. They emerge from decisions made late at night, shaped by fear of being wrong more than confidence in being right. In one direction, Washington holds its line and waits. Prices stay elevated but manageable. Allies adapt. Markets learn to live with the disruption. Over time, the shock dulls into a new normal. The problem with this path is subtle but corrosive. Every month that passes teaches the world that U.S. energy stability can be interrupted abruptly and politically. That lesson lingers. Investment decisions change. Long-term contracts tilt away. Influence erodes without a single dramatic loss. In another direction, pressure forces a visible reversal. Quiet outreach begins. Exceptions appear. Signals are sent that supply will be allowed to flow again, even if the language never admits it. Prices ease. Political heat cools. But the cost here is credibility. Once partners and rivals believe pressure can be undone by domestic pain, future threats weaken. Strength starts to look conditional, and conditional strength invites testing. There is also a path where neither side fully backs down and neither side fully escalates. The situation drags. Uncertainty becomes permanent. Markets stay jumpy. Allies keep hedging. Consumers keep paying more. This path is the most dangerous because it feels survivable day to day while doing the most long-term damage. It trains everyone involved to plan around instability instead of resolving it. What makes this moment risky is that these futures can coexist at the start. Different parts of the system may already be moving in different directions. One arm signaling restraint, another preparing pressure, another searching for an exit. When strategies diverge internally, outcomes become accidental rather than intentional. This is how history often turns, not with a single wrong move, but with several half moves that pull against each other until momentum decides the outcome. And once momentum takes over, even the people in charge stop fully controlling where it leads. This is the point where events stop being judged by intent and start being judged by outcome. Not tomorrow, not after the next briefing, now, because the system has already absorbed the shock, adapted to it, and begun pricing its consequences into everyday life. Once that happens, reversing course is no longer a switch you flip. It's a climb back uphill against expectations that have already hardened. The next 48 to 72 hours matter more than the strike itself. In that window, uncertainty either collapses into a new equilibrium or spreads further into markets, alliances, and domestic politics. If clarity arrives, it will lock narratives in place. If it doesn't, momentum will choose a direction without permission from anyone in charge. History is ruthless about this. It records what followed, not what was meant. Years from now, analysts will argue over whether this decision projected strength or revealed miscalculation. Some will point to pressure, others to principle. But none of that will matter as much as a simpler question. Did this make Americans more secure, more stable, and less exposed to forces they don't control? Or did it teach the world that U.S. policy can raise costs at home while handing leverage abroad? Right now, that answer is still being written, not in speeches, but in price boards, contracts, and quiet decisions made far from cameras. This is how turning points really work. They don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly through consequences that refuse to stay contained. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. The most dangerous part isn't what already happened. It's what happens next, once the adrenaline fades and the bill keeps coming due.